From a director who secretly owned the land he was filming on to an actor who left to make another movie while waiting around, Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate became Hollywood's most notorious disaster through bizarre behind-the-scenes chaos that rivals any fiction. Prepare to discover production secrets so strange they helped destroy an entire studio. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Heaven's Gate. Fact 1. Director secretly owned filming location. When United Artists executives started questioning why they were paying such enormous amounts of money to rent the land where Heaven's Gate was being filmed in Montana, they decided to investigate the situation more closely. The studio was already dealing with massive cost overruns on Michael Cimino's epic western, which had ballooned from an original budget of $11.6 million to what would eventually become a staggering $44 million disaster. Every expense was being scrutinized as the production spiraled further out of control, so the high land rental fees naturally caught their attention. What the executives discovered when they checked the local tax records was both shocking and infuriating. The property owner listed on the official documents was none other than Michael Cimino himself, the very director they had hired to make their movie. This meant that throughout the entire troubled production, United Artists had been essentially paying Cimino to rent his own land, with studio money flowing directly from their accounts into his personal bank account through these rental fees. The revelation added another layer of controversy to what was already becoming Hollywood's most notorious production disaster. Cimino had purchased 156 acres of Montana property during the filming process, spending $10,000 on a Jeep and investing heavily in local real estate, while the studio executives back in Los Angeles remained completely unaware of his land ownership. This discovery became just one more example of how Cimino had managed to exploit his position and the studio's trust during the chaotic production. Years later, after Heaven's Gate had destroyed United Artists and ended Cimino's career as a major Hollywood director, the Montana land he had purchased with such confidence was quietly put up for sale in 1984, though there were reportedly no takers interested in buying the property. Fact 2. John Hurt made another movie while waiting. John Hurt's experience on the Heaven's Gate set perfectly captures just how chaotic and poorly organized Michael Cimino's production had become. The respected British actor, who played William Billy Irvine in the film, found himself with enormous amounts of downtime between scenes as Cimino's obsessive perfectionism led to endless delays and scheduling problems throughout the Montana shoot. Rather than sit around the Outlaw Inn motel in Kalispell where the cast and crew were housed, Hurt decided to make productive use of his unexpected free time by taking on another film project. He traveled back to England to work with director David Lynch on The Elephant Man, a biographical drama about Joseph Merrick that would become one of 1980's most acclaimed films. The fact that Hurt could complete an entire movie production with another director and then return to Montana to finish his Heaven's Gate scenes speaks volumes about how far behind schedule Cimino's project had fallen. This wasn't just a quick trip for a few days of filming either. Hurt was able to fully commit to The Elephant Man, delivering one of his most memorable performances as the compassionate Dr. Frederick Treves, while Cimino continued shooting other scenes with the rest of the Heaven's Gate cast back in Montana. The situation became so routine that other actors and crew members began referring to these extended waiting periods as just another normal part of working on a Cimino production. When Hurt finally returned to complete his remaining Heaven's Gate scenes, the production was still nowhere near finished, and the costs continued mounting daily. His ability to squeeze in an entirely separate film project during what was supposed to be a single continuous shoot remains one of the most telling examples of how completely out of control the Heaven's Gate production had become. Fact 3. Willem Dafoe, fired for laughing. Willem Dafoe's very first experience in Hollywood became a nightmare that would haunt him for years, all because he committed the apparently unforgivable sin of laughing at the wrong moment on Michael Cimino's set. The young actor had been cast in Heaven's Gate because Cimino wanted performers who looked foreign and could speak in other languages, and Dafoe had impressed the director during his audition by delivering what sounded like a convincing monologue in Dutch. What Cimino didn't know was that Dafoe couldn't actually speak Dutch at all. A friend had simply written down the words phonetically in English, so Dafoe could memorize the sounds without understanding their meaning. This deception worked perfectly until Cimino asked Dafoe to improvise additional Dutch dialogue during filming, which was obviously impossible since the actor had no real knowledge of the language. Already annoyed by this discovery, Cimino demoted Dafoe from his larger speaking role and relegated him to being just another face in the crowd of cockfighting scene extras. During one particularly grueling 8-hour lighting setup, the cast and crew were forced to wait motionless while Cimino and his team adjusted equipment and planned camera angles. To pass the endless time, one of the other extras quietly told Dafoe a joke, and Dafoe responded with audible laughter. That single laugh sealed his fate. Cimino immediately ordered Dafoe to return to his hotel room, where an assistant director later informed him that his scenes had been completed and his services were no longer needed. Dafoe's role was cut so severely that he appears uncredited in the final film, visible only briefly in crowd shots. Years later, when Cimino approached Dafoe about appearing in another project, the actor firmly declined, still remembering the humiliation of being fired for simply laughing during his film debut. Fact 4. Harvard scenes shot at Oxford University. When Michael Cimino approached Harvard University about filming the opening graduation sequences for Heaven's Gate, the prestigious institution flatly refused to allow the production on their campus. Harvard officials were reportedly put off by Cimino's excessive demands for transforming their historic buildings and grounds to match his very specific vision for the 1870 scenes that would open his epic Western film. Rather than find another American university or build sets from scratch, Cimino made the unusual decision to travel across the Atlantic Ocean and film at Oxford University in England instead. The irony was not lost on anyone involved that audiences would be watching characters supposedly graduating from America's most famous university, while actually seeing some of Britain's most recognizable academic landmarks filling the screen. The production used several iconic Oxford locations to create their fictional Harvard graduation ceremony. The formal graduation address by Reverend Dr., played by Joseph Cotton, was filmed inside the magnificent Sheldonian Theatre on Broad Street, a building designed by Christopher Wren in the 1660s that normally hosts university ceremonies and classical music concerts. The graduation procession scenes showed Chris Christopherson and John Hurt walking along New College Lane and beneath the famous Bridge of Sighs at Hertford College, both instantly recognizable Oxford landmarks. For the elaborate outdoor graduation dance sequence, Cimino transformed the Victorian Quad at Mansfield College, where local Oxford students were recruited as extras to waltz around a massive tree that had been specially transported and replanted in the courtyard. The architectural differences between the two universities are quite obvious to anyone familiar with both institutions, since Oxford features a mixture of medieval and classical styles, while Harvard buildings follow strictly Georgian architectural principles, making the substitution fairly easy to spot for observant viewers. Fact 5. Cimino changed studio locks. As the pressure mounted during post-production and United Artists executives grew increasingly desperate to see what Michael Cimino was doing with their $44 million investment, the director took extreme measures to keep studio interference away from his editing process. Cimino was facing a Christmas 1980 deadline that seemed impossible to meet, and he knew that any preview of his work would likely result in the studio demanding major changes or possibly even firing him from the project entirely. Working 18-hour days in his editing room with Oscar-winning editor William Reynolds, Cimino decided to turn his workspace into a fortress that no studio executive could penetrate. He had all the locks on the editing room doors changed so that only he and his immediate team could gain access to the facility where he was painstakingly assembling his epic from the massive amount of footage he had shot in Montana. But changing the locks wasn't enough security for the paranoid director. Cimino also had metal bars installed on all the windows of the editing room, creating what assistant editor Penelope Shaw later described as a prison-like environment designed to keep people out rather than in. The bars ensured that even if studio executives tried to peek through the windows to catch a glimpse of the work in progress, they would be completely blocked from seeing anything happening inside. This fortress mentality extended to Cimino's general behavior during the final months of post-production, as he became increasingly secretive and protective of his footage while working around the clock to meet his contractual obligations. The irony was that despite all these security measures, when Cimino finally did present his first cut to United Artists executives, it ran 5 hours and 25 minutes long, confirming their worst fears about what he had been creating behind those locked doors and barred windows. Fact 6. Musicians stranded for months. What was supposed to be a simple 3-week musical recording session in Montana turned into one of the most expensive and prolonged jam sessions in Hollywood history when Michael Cimino's chaotic production schedule left an entire group of musicians stranded far from home with nothing to do but wait. The musicians had been brought to the remote Montana location specifically to work on scenes involving the Heaven's Gate Band, which played an important role in the film's roller skating sequences and other musical moments throughout the story. As delays mounted and Cimino's obsessive retakes pushed the production further and further behind schedule, these professional musicians found themselves stuck in Kalispell with their instruments, but no actual filming to participate in for weeks and sometimes months at a time. Rather than send them home and risk having to bring them back later, the production kept them on payroll while they waited for their scenes to be scheduled, rescheduled, and rescheduled again. The Associated Press later described the musicians' experience as both stunningly boring and a raucous good time, filled with jam sessions and strange adventures, but very little actual shooting. With so much free time on their hands and a variety of talented performers gathered in one place, the musicians began organizing informal concerts and collaborative recording sessions that had nothing to do with the movie itself. These extended musical gatherings became the foundation for lasting friendships and creative partnerships, particularly between actors Jeff Bridges and Chris Christopherson, both of whom were accomplished musicians in their own right. The jam sessions they participated in during those long Montana months led to numerous musical collaborations that continued long after Heaven's Gate wrapped production, creating one of the few positive legacies to emerge from Cimino's troubled and expensive filmmaking process. Fact 7. Real animal deaths prompted industry reform. The animal cruelty that occurred during Heaven's Gate production was so extreme and widely documented that it became a turning point for how Hollywood handles animals on film sets, leading to permanent changes in industry practices that remain in effect today. The American Humane Association had attempted to monitor the production but was reportedly barred from the set by Michael Cimino and his crew, leaving animals completely unprotected during some of the most dangerous action sequences ever filmed. Documentation from the production reveals that animals were deliberately killed for the sake of getting realistic shots, including horses that were wire-tripped during battle scenes, and at least one horse that was blown up with dynamite during the climactic fight sequence. Real cockfights were filmed rather than using trained animals or special effects. Chickens were decapitated on camera, and cattle were bled to provide authentic-looking blood that could be smeared on actors instead of using stage blood. The owner of one abused Arabian horse filed a lawsuit against the producers, director, and horse wrangler, citing wrongful injury and breach of contract for willfully depriving her animal of proper care. The legal documents described the severe physical and behavioral trauma and disfigurement suffered by the horse, though the case was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. The public outcry over these incidents was immediate and sustained, with the American Humane Association organizing picket lines outside movie theaters in Hollywood, while local humane societies staged similar protests across the United States. The controversy became so significant that in 1980, the Screen Actors Guild and the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers added contractual provisions that permanently authorized the American Humane Association to monitor the use of all animals in filmed entertainment, creating the modern system of animal safety oversight that protects animals in movies and television shows today. Fact 8. Premiere audience hated it so much. The world premiere of Heaven's Gate on November 19, 1980, at the Cinema One Theater in New York City, became one of the most awkward and devastating nights in Hollywood history, with an audience reaction so cold and hostile that it immediately spelled doom for Michael Cimino's epic Western. United Artists had spent $1.5 million advertising the film during the 3 weeks leading up to this crucial premiere, hoping that positive word of mouth from the New York debut would help overcome the negative publicity that had been building around the troubled production. As the 3-hour and 39-minute film unfolded on screen, the audience grew increasingly restless and unresponsive, with many people clearly struggling to stay engaged with Cimino's slow-paced and often confusing narrative. When the intermission finally arrived, providing a much-needed break from what many viewers were already considering an endurance test, the atmosphere in the theater lobby was notably subdued and uncomfortable. Cimino, who had been anxiously watching the audience reactions throughout the first half of the screening, noticed that despite the elaborate champagne reception that had been prepared for the premiere guests, very few people were actually drinking or socializing during the intermission break. Confused and concerned by the lack of celebration, he approached his publicist to ask why the crowd seemed so uninterested in the refreshments that had been provided for what was supposed to be a triumphant evening. The publicist's brutally honest response became legendary in Hollywood circles for its directness and accuracy. When Cimino asked why no one was drinking the champagne, his publicist simply replied, "Because they hate the movie, Michael." This single exchange perfectly captured the disaster that was unfolding, as the premiere audience's negative reaction foreshadowed the critical and commercial failure that would destroy both the film and the studio that produced it. Fact 9. Street rebuilt for 6-foot width. Michael Cimino's obsessive attention to detail and perfectionist approach to filmmaking reached almost absurd levels when he decided that an entire street set that had been carefully constructed for Heaven's Gate simply didn't look right and needed to be completely rebuilt. The street in question had been built to his exact specifications by the construction crew, with buildings lining both sides of the road, to create the authentic 1890s Wyoming town atmosphere that Cimino was determined to achieve for his epic western. After viewing the completed street set, Cimino declared that the space between the buildings was too narrow, and that the entire street needed to be exactly 6 feet wider to properly accommodate his camera movements and create the visual composition he had envisioned. The set construction boss, trying to save both time and the studio's rapidly dwindling budget, proposed what seemed like an obvious and economical solution to the problem. The construction supervisor suggested that they could simply tear down all the buildings on one side of the street and move them back 6 feet, which would create the additional width that Cimino wanted, while requiring only half the demolition and reconstruction work. This approach would have saved thousands of dollars and several days of valuable production time, both of which were in critically short supply as the Heaven's Gate budget continued spiraling out of control. However, Cimino rejected this sensible cost-saving measure and insisted that both sides of the street be dismantled and moved back exactly 3 feet each, requiring the complete demolition and reconstruction of every single building on the set. His reasoning was that this symmetrical approach would create better visual balance in his shots, even though the end result would look identical to what could have been achieved with the cheaper single-side option. This decision became another perfect example of how Cimino's uncompromising artistic vision consistently prioritized his personal aesthetic preferences over practical filmmaking considerations. Fact 10. Cost nearly $300 per minute. The financial catastrophe of Heaven's Gate becomes even more staggering when you break down the costs into daily expenses and calculate how much money Michael Cimino was burning through for every minute of usable footage he managed to produce. With the final production budget reaching $44 million, which would be equivalent to roughly $296 million in today's money, Heaven's Gate became one of the most expensive films ever made at that time. Stephen Bach, the United Artists executive who monitored the production costs throughout the disastrous shoot, calculated that the film was costing approximately $200,000 per day just in salaries, location fees, and acting expenses. This daily burn rate didn't even include the massive costs for equipment, sets, costumes, and the other production expenses that were mounting continuously as Cimino's perfectionist approach stretched the shooting schedule far beyond its original timeline. The situation became so extreme that Bach famously declared the film was costing nearly $1 million per minute of usable footage, making Heaven's Gate one of the most expensive minutes of cinema ever produced. This calculation was based on Cimino's incredibly slow pace of filming, where he would often shoot 50 or more takes of simple scenes that would last only seconds in the final cut, and his tendency to spend entire days waiting for perfect lighting conditions or cloud formations. After 6 days of principal photography, Cimino was already 5 days behind schedule and had burned through $900,000 to produce just 1 minute of footage that would actually appear in the finished film. By the 2-week mark, he was 10 days behind schedule with only 3 minutes of usable material to show for the enormous expenditure, creating a cost-per-minute ratio that was virtually unprecedented in Hollywood history and helped establish Heaven's Gate as the ultimate cautionary tale about runaway production budgets. Fact 11. Dafoe spoke fake Dutch at audition. Willem Dafoe's casting in Heaven's Gate came about through one of the most creative acts of deception in Hollywood audition history, as the young actor managed to convince Michael Cimino that he could speak fluent Dutch when he actually had no knowledge of the language whatsoever. Cimino was specifically looking for actors who appeared foreign and could authentically speak in other languages, since Heaven's Gate featured numerous European immigrant characters who needed to sound genuinely European rather than like American actors attempting accents. When Dafoe learned about the audition requirements, he realized that his lack of foreign language skills would prevent him from being considered for the role, so he devised an ingenious plan to overcome this obstacle. He approached a Dutch-speaking friend, and asked them to write out a dramatic monologue in Dutch. But instead of learning the actual language, Defoe had his friend write down all the Dutch words phonetically using English spelling so that he could memorize the sounds without understanding their meaning. During his audition, Defoe delivered this phonetic Dutch monologue with such conviction and apparent fluency that Cimino was completely fooled and immediately became impressed with what he believed was the actor's natural linguistic ability. The performance was so convincing that Defoe was cast in what was originally planned to be a much larger speaking role, with Cimino expecting him to be able to improvise additional Dutch dialogue during filming. The deception was discovered when Cimino asked Defoe to create new Dutch dialogue on the spot during production, which was obviously impossible since the actor had simply memorized phonetic sounds rather than learning actual Dutch vocabulary or grammar. This revelation contributed to Cimino's growing frustration with Defoe, ultimately leading to the actor's role being severely reduced and his eventual firing from the production after the infamous laughing incident during the lengthy lighting setup. Fact 12. Tree transported from Montana to Oxford. When Michael Cimino decided to film the Harvard graduation dance sequence at Mansfield College in Oxford, England, he encountered what seemed like an insurmountable problem with the location's existing landscape. The Victorian courtyard at Mansfield College was spacious enough to accommodate the elaborate waltz scene he had envisioned, where dozens of newly graduated students would dance in concentric circles around a central focal point, but the area lacked the majestic tree that Cimino believed was essential for creating the proper visual composition. Rather than finding a suitable tree already growing somewhere in Oxford or commissioning local landscapers to plant an appropriate specimen, Cimino made the extraordinary decision to transport a massive tree from his Montana filming locations all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to England. This wasn't simply a matter of digging up a tree and shipping it in one piece, which would have been logistically impossible given the size and weight of the specimen he had selected. The tree had to be carefully cut down and completely dismantled, with every branch, section of trunk, and major root system being catalogued and packed for international shipping. Once all the pieces arrived at Mansfield College, a team of specialists reassembled the entire tree in the center of the courtyard, methodically reattaching each branch to its original position on the trunk and ensuring that the reconstructed tree looked as natural and authentic as it had when it was growing in the Montana wilderness. Witnesses to the filming described the reassembled tree as extraordinary and impressive, creating exactly the kind of majestic centerpiece that Cimino had envisioned for his graduation dance sequence. Students recruited as extras waltzed around this transported Montana tree, while the Blue Danube played from enormous speakers, creating a surreal scene where American students pretending to be at Harvard danced around a Montana tree in an English college courtyard. Fact 13. Color vanished during roller skating scene. One of the most bizarre technical failures in Heaven's Gate occurs during the famous roller skating sequence at the Heaven's Gate Dance Hall, where viewers can literally watch the color drain out of the film in real time as the scene progresses. The roller skating scene was meant to be one of the visual highlights of the movie, showcasing the vibrant community life of the European immigrant settlers as they gathered for entertainment and socializing in their makeshift Wyoming town. The sequence begins with full-color cinematography, showing the warm tones of the wooden dance hall, the colorful period costumes worn by the dancers and musicians, and the rich brown and golden hues that cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond had carefully crafted to give the film its distinctive visual style. Jeff Bridges and other cast members can be seen roller skating and dancing in what appears to be a lively and visually appealing community celebration. However, as the scene continues, something goes dramatically wrong with either the film stock, the processing, or the color timing, causing all the vibrant colors to gradually fade away until only brown and black tones remain visible on screen. This isn't a subtle shift or artistic choice, but rather an obvious technical malfunction that leaves viewers watching what essentially becomes a sepia-toned or black and white sequence in the middle of what was supposed to be a full-color film. The color disappearance is so noticeable and jarring that it completely disrupts the viewing experience, making it impossible to focus on the performances or story elements because the technical failure becomes the most prominent aspect of the scene. This cinematographic disaster became yet another example of the technical problems that plagued Heaven's Gate throughout its production and post-production process, contributing to the film's reputation as a project where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Fact 14. 5-hour work print, shown to executives. On June 26, 1980, Michael Cimino presented what he considered his rough cut of Heaven's Gate to United Artists executives in what became one of the most shocking screenings in Hollywood history. The workprint that Cimino showed them ran an absolutely staggering 5 hours and 25 minutes, which is longer than most people's entire workday and nearly twice the length of epic films like Lawrence of Arabia or Gone with the Wind. This mammoth running time was the result of Cimino's attempt to edit down the truly enormous amount of footage he had shot during the troubled Montana production. The director and his team had been working with approximately 220 hours of raw footage, which equals more than 1 million feet of film and represents one of the largest amounts of material ever shot for a single movie production in Hollywood history. The most absurd example of Cimino's editorial excess was the climactic battle sequence between the immigrant settlers and the cattle barons' hired gunmen, which alone lasted 80 minutes in this initial cut. To put that in perspective, the entire battle scene was longer than many complete feature films, and it represented nearly a quarter of the total running time for what was supposed to be just one action sequence within the larger story. Cimino told the horrified executives that this version was still not his final cut and that he believed he could trim maybe 15 minutes from the total running time, suggesting that he saw very little fat to cut from his 5.5-hour epic. The United Artists executives flatly refused to release any film at that length and once again seriously considered firing Cimino from the project, though they ultimately decided to give him another chance to create a more commercially viable version of his Western epic. Fact 15. Tom Noonan called it life's worst experience. Actor Tom Noonan's experience working with Michael Cimino on Heaven's Gate became so traumatic that he later described it as one of the worst experiences of his entire life, with allegations of director behavior that went far beyond the typical conflicts between filmmakers and performers. Noonan, who would later become known for his work in films like Manhunter and The Monster Squad, was just beginning his acting career when he was cast in Heaven's Gate and had no way of knowing what he was getting himself into. According to Noonan's later interviews about the production, his relationship with Cimino deteriorated to the point where the director's treatment of actors, actresses, and crew members became genuinely abusive rather than simply demanding or perfectionist. The situation allegedly escalated during one particular dispute between Noonan and Cimino when the actor claims that the director actually held a loaded gun to his head as a way of intimidating him and asserting his authority on the set. This shocking allegation, if true, represents an extreme example of the tyrannical directorial behavior that multiple cast and crew members reported experiencing during the Heaven's Gate production. Cimino had developed a reputation for his authoritarian approach to filmmaking, with stories circulating about his treatment of everyone from major stars to low-level crew members, but Noonan's account suggests that the director's behavior crossed the line from professional misconduct into potentially criminal territory. The gun incident, combined with the general atmosphere of fear and intimidation that Noonan described experiencing throughout the production, left such a lasting negative impression that he publicly spoke out about his treatment years later. His willingness to go on record with these serious allegations helped establish the legend of Cimino as one of Hollywood's most difficult and potentially dangerous directors, adding another dark chapter to the already notorious story of Heaven's Gate's troubled production.